Welcome to Truth Nation. My name's Bill Bodner. With me today, the co-host, Chief Mark Garrett. What's happening, Chief?
I love putting the retired disclaimer in front of that. Yeah, because I couldn't be happier. Good morning, Bill.
You don't want to be a defendant in any more lawsuits either. Let's make sure they all know that you're out. Same with me.
Exactly.
Mark, we're going to turn back the clock today, all the way back to 2002, a rather notorious case, the murder of Laci Peterson in Northern California. Where is that, Modesto? Am I right
Yeah.
that was Modesto?
Yeah, it was Modesto.
Modesto, California. Talk a little bit about the investigation. And I know some people will say, hey, why in the world are you talking about this now, 22 years later? And some of our astute listeners, Mark, will say, the LA Innocence Project. They filed an appeal on behalf of Scott Peterson, the husband of Laci, or actually the person that was convicted for the murder. Let's put it that way.
I call him the self-imposed widower.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's something we'll talk about too, how he said he was a widow before his wife even died, which is an interesting trick. But really, the reason we're going to talk about it is not so much because of the Innocence Project appeal. And by the way, let's make a distinction. This is the LA Innocence Project.
Yeah.
It's because of something I call juris opportunism. Now, I made that up, Mark. I'll be upfront about it. But let me explain what that is. And I think when I tell you a couple little facts here, you'll say, wow, that's a little too much to be coincidental. First off, turning back the clock to 2002, this was still a period in California that I referred to as, brace yourself, the OJ hangover days. Meaning that anytime you had a jury trial at that time, there was some fear of jury nullification. There was some fear that no matter what evidence you put on, the jury would just say, we're not convicting this guy. In this Peterson case, although there's significant evidence, there's not a lot of traditional evidence. In other words, there's no murder weapon. There's no location where the murder took place, to my knowledge. In other words, there's no crime scene. There's no crime scene. There's no murder weapon. And there's really no method of death, to my knowledge. And I could be wrong about that, Mark. I'm sure you'll probably fill me in if I'm wrong. But yet he was convicted. There was, in my opinion, because of what happened with the OJ case, there was really the mindset of prosecutors when they had someone they were charging was, we're going to convict this guy, right? Now, you remember a couple of weeks ago, Mark, we talked about the documentary American Nightmare.
Yes.
A case where, a domestic violence case, police thought it was a murder. Some similarities, you could say, at least with the Vallejo theory of what happened, thinking that Denise Huskins was murdered, right? What day did that documentary get released to the public? I'm not putting you on the spot or anything.
Yeah.
I feel like, January 17th of this year. So American Nightmare, the documentary, was released to the public January 17th, 2024. What day did the LA Innocence Project file their appeal in this case on behalf of Scott Peterson?
It was a couple of days later.
January 18th, January 18th.
Yeah, one day later.
Right. And so my point is, Mark, that's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
Right. In my opinion, that's not a coincidence. They were trying to ride the wave that American Nightmare created, a case where there was a lot of criticism on tunnel vision of law enforcement, on what did we call it? Confirmation bias, not looking, just having their theory and just going all ahead to prove their theory, regardless of what other evidence came up. And the LA Innocence Project, in my opinion, said, hey, we're gonna ride that wave. We're gonna file this appeal, and we're gonna make this case seem very similar to that case that the public is now behind, and we may get Scott Peterson a new trial. If I were to tell you that was my theory on them filing this, and the day filing it the day after the movie premiered, American Nightmare premiered, do you think that's purely coincidence, or do you think that they read the tea leaves and it's, like I said, juris opportunism? They said, hey, here's an opportunity for us to ride this wave, to make this case today, to make the 2002 case against Scott Peterson, which has nothing to do with the Huskins case, the kidnapping, has nothing to do with it, but we're gonna show some similar elements, which is gonna turn public sentiment and perhaps give this guy another trial. Am I crazy to think that that has something to do with it, Mark?
Well, I don't believe so. I cannot obviously get in the minds of the management team, the players, and of the Los Angeles Innocence Project, who knows exactly what they're thinking. But I think your theory, Bill, is dead on. And one of the reasons I think that it's dead on is ironically because a lot of the information actually in the Scott Peterson murder case, and we're going to talk about this, I'm sure, in depth about circumstantial evidence. So when we talk about that in his case, I think we can apply the same reasoning to why would the LA Innocence Project. And I think just moving forward for purposes of this podcast, when we say
Mhm.
the Innocence Project, we're talking about the Los Angeles because there are multiple chapters of the Innocence Project across the country.
Right.
So I think that we can apply the same standard to the Innocence Project here about circumstantial evidence. Man, that's just quite a coincidence. It's, by the way, it's not the only coincidence, so to speak. There's a lot of coincidence that they're drawing from as far as their argument. It looks like, and we're going to talk about
Mhm.
why are they doing this and what are they basing it on. But there are some similarities with the Huskins case and with this. But again, I think we'll dive into it. Neither of those had anything to do really with, well, actually, that's so funny because in the Hudson's case, something did have to do with the actual kidnapping. But it's I'm gonna let you go ahead and take it from here, for right now. But no, I do not think you're off base. I think you're 100% right in your opinion that this is not by chance about when this was filed.
Right. And it's just opportunism, just so people understand that. It happens all the time in our justice system, and maybe it's a particular jury verdict that then everyone looks at and says, "Wow, this person was convicted with this type of evidence. Now we need this type of evidence." Remember, now everything's DNA.
Hmm.
Even is there a law that says you need DNA evidence to prove that this person possessed a handgun? No, there's not. But really, it's become almost a necessary part of every case. You have to have DNA evidence.
Hmm.
So my point is just that these things happen in our justice system, and people just glom onto them and ride the wave for better or for worse. So looking back at this case, Mark, you want to start just talking about what some of the circumstantial evidence was in the case or the timeline of it? I remember, yeah, Christmas Eve,
Yeah.
2002, Mark Scott Peterson
Yeah, yeah, careful
wakes up.
there.
Wait,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, my wife is
Wakes up,
alive and kicking, and it's gonna be that way until I croak first,
right?
okay? Yeah.
Yeah. Scott Peterson wakes up in the morning. He says he and his wife watch the Martha Stewart show. That was the last thing they did together. And then he goes off fishing for the day, drives 90 miles away. Now, they asked him what was on the Martha Stewart show that you watched, and his recollection was it was some kind of meringue, if I'm remembering correctly. They baked some kind of meringue pie, and the police contacted the network, researched that particular show, and said no. In fact, that was not what was on that day. There was no meringue being prepared, so that's evidence that he murdered his wife. A lot of little things like that in his stories, which they paint a picture of him as not the brightest guy in the world, but don't necessarily really lend any evidence to the fact that he murdered his wife. The boat. Throughout the trial, this boat that he purchased was referred to as a fishing boat.
Mhm.
It's a 14-foot open boat, Mark. I would call that more of a rowboat. Would you call that a fishing boat?
Yeah, I'm not a fisherman myself, but I have a boat and out in the marina a lot, and I agree with you. This sounds like a purchase of convenience and specific utility, not necessarily for somebody who is planning to, go fishing a lot, by the way. And there's a litany of these points that I hope you touch on, and I can too.
Hmm.
But Scott Peterson hadn't had a valid fisherman's license, I think, for, I don't know, 20 something years before this. And a couple of days before Laci turns up missing, he goes out and purchases a fishing license good for only 2 days and buys a boat to go fishing. You talk about circumstantial evidence. And again, these are just a couple of almost endless examples of circumstantial evidence. So, Bill, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, no. So some of the strange things, strange parts of this case, Mark, it was, I think according to the testimony at trial, or even his own defense lawyer referred to him as a serial philanderer, said that he had multiple affairs, and his wife or Laci had never confided in anyone that they were having any kind of marital problems, right? That's
Mhm.
interesting, right?
Yes.
No one knew that he had not. I guess his wife didn't even know he bought a boat, or they hadn't shared it outside the family. No one,
No.
no one outside. That's a better way to say it because we don't know what she knew, but no one outside the
Right.
family knew that he had bought a boat.
And,
What
and,
else?
any, and anyone in the family, in other words, the in-laws, things like the
Right,
siblings, in other words, they could have said, "Oh yes, Lacey told us that Scott had purchased a boat." Like you said, no one ever came forward and said that he had talked about buying a boat. I was talking to my wife yesterday about buying some accessories for the boat that we currently own. Hey, it's okay if I
right.
get this, or do you want to get this? These are things that if you're married, for the most part, you have discussions about. It's weird. The other thing again, it's all circumstantial. And Bill, you made such a good point about we live in a day and age now where, because of all these crime scene shows, and people think that there's like a 95% solve rate in homicides, and you go out there and you put two and two together, you get the DNA, you get this forensic, and blah blah, eventually leads you to somebody in 8 hours. It doesn't work like that.
Right,
And but in addition to what you just said, one of the other things is that he had made a point, because many people testified to this, that Scott Peterson, a couple of days before Laci turned up missing, he had gone around to talking to different neighbors about his plans to go fishing, talking to different
mm,
neighbors about this. In other words, making sure that there are going to be third party witnesses that could provide an alibi for, oh, yeah, he told us he was going fishing, things like this. When in the hell do you go around talking to your neighbors, especially for someone who apparently hadn't been fishing for the longest time, and they're going to go out by yourself? By the way, in 40-degree weather, apparently. There's so many aspects to this that don't make any sense. And I actually have a paragraph here. I'm going to hold off for a minute, but I want you to go ahead and finish your thoughts on some of the stuff.
no, go ahead. I was just going to talk about some of the other circumstantial stuff, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, this is actually from an article, and there's a lot, it's a really great article. A ton of information here about the trial, and going to your point about DNA, the lack of DNA, things like this. But this is from the outlet Vox, the V is in Victor OX. And this is just really just the end of January, this article came out. But one paragraph here out of a very long article. To justify Scott Peterson's behavior, you have to posit a set of extraordinary circumstances, including that he just so happened to mention his wife's demise to his girlfriend. Coincidentally, in the very same week, he abruptly evinced an interest in fishing for the first time since the 1990s. Coincidentally, buying the same boat where her hair would later be found, after he coincidentally went fishing in the same region of the bay where her body would eventually be found, all while coincidentally lying repeatedly about his own actions. In a fictional scenario, it might be fun to imagine that all those details could be the result of some bizarre, surprise explanation. But in the real world, a world where homicide by the intimate partners is a leading cause of death for pregnant women, would we know better? And again, this is almost a summation of the article, and they do a very good job of articulating some of these coincidences in there. But this is where grown-ups, this is where objective people actually look at the totality of the
Right.
circumstances. Like you said, Bill, not just the lack of DNA, because listen, Everybody before, I'm pick a date, the early 1990s, everybody convicted of murder up to that point was convicted without DNA evidence, right?
Hmm.
Not zero biological evidence, obviously, because you have blood maps and things like this where we're not totally determinative, but they can exclude other people. So before that, we had people that were convicted of murder. That's the only way they were convicted. It was basically through eyewitness accounts, other physical evidence, and circumstantial evidence. And we have probably at least as much circumstantial evidence in this case, if not more, than we had in the O.J. Simpson case in 1994, went to trial in 95. And I'm going to talk
Hmm.
about that kind of interesting nexus between the two cases here in a little bit. But yeah, in other words, the totality of all of the coincidences that would have had to have take place in order for this man to be innocent are really beyond any I think fair-minded person's ability.
Agree. Agree 100%. A couple other things. Before several days, if not a week or more, before Laci went missing, he told his girlfriend, Amber Fry, that he was a widower, right?
Yes.
So,
Well,
yeah,
I think
he
what I read in the article, Bill, is said that I had lost my wife. Now, I'm thinking that is like you said. I agree with your interpretation of that. That his wife had passed away, and he may have actually said my wife was dead or murdered or someplace else. The article I
right,
read, he said I lost my wife, which I think any reasonable person would take it to mean that your wife had passed away. Yes.
right. And then I don't know, the one that's very damning, the purchase of 90 pounds of concrete. Purchased 90 pounds of concrete, said that he wanted to use it for a boat anchor. And I think they showed that the boat anchor was only a small portion of that 90 pounds. And they asked him, so what did you do with the rest of it? And he said, I patched my driveway. And they went and examined the driveway and they found that the concrete in the driveway was actually a completely different type of concrete than he had purchased. So what happened to the other, I don't know how much, they didn't say, but the other 80 pounds, whatever it was, of concrete. And the theory is that that he made weights to weight down the body when the body was dumped in the ocean.
And if I remember
Yeah,
correctly, which is not in this article I'm referring to, but I do remember that they found or either and the molds or concrete dust in the garage, if I remember correctly. So they actually found a direct physical link to, in other words, the use of the concrete that he purchased on his
right.
property. Mhm.
Right, they did, and then I think also, in the boat, and of course, he would say, "Well, that's from the one anchor that I did use," but they were almost, I think, able to show in the boat where these other weights or whatever they were sitting just based on imprints and dust that was left
Right.
in the boat.
And by the way,
Um,
Bill, when people are for this podcast, when you're considering the circumstantial evidence, it was a very small boat that he purchased.
mhm,
Why anybody would have to purchase concrete in order to cast their own anchor for this boat is beyond me. I In other words, that story in and of itself, I guess maybe it's done. I guess there's something that says you can't make your own anchor out of concrete, but why you wouldn't be able simply to purchase an
mhm.
aluminum or an iron anchor the same place where you purchased the boat, it seems like it'd be a lot easier, a lot less intrusive in your time. But that's just an ancillary observation.
But Amber Fry, so Lacey disappeared Christmas Eve. Amber Fry, I guess, came forward about a month later. It was sometime in January, the middle, late January.
Mhm.
And she called police because she saw him on TV and she said, "Hey, I've been dating this guy." Um, Crazy that some of the stories, I guess the best way to say it is some of the elaborate stories that he told her about his whereabouts and what he was doing. For example, he was at a vigil for Lacey when she was missing. I don't, it might have even been New Year's Eve or sometime right the 30th, 31st of December. And he was actually on the phone with Amber Fry and said he was in Paris and he was overlooking the Eiffel Tower. He was on a business trip and et cetera. It's just these very elaborate stories and lies that he told, were a little bit out there, right?
A little bit. I put that in quotes. They were
Yeah.
way out there, but it just goes to show the level of uh, the level of continuous dishonesty from this guy, going back to his infidelity with his wife. In other words,
Hmm.
even before the marriage started, and almost continuously, and then these different statements. That one right there is completely provable. Provable. He says that he was in Paris. It's pretty easy to find out if someone was in Paris or not, if they were in fact at a candlelight vigil for his now at this time missing wife. So
Yeah.
his credibility there, I think, is in question at least.
Yeah. So, Mark, the police reclassify the case now as a homicide case.
Mhm.
And I think the body was recovered sometime in April, if I'm not mistaken,
I
washed
believe
up on
that's
the
right.
shore. And
Hmm.
and Mark, how close was it? Do you know how close that was to where he went fishing? I think it was relatively close to where he was, the marina where he went fishing, was it not?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly in miles, but it was very, very close. And here's the thing, if I remember this off the top of my head, I think it was about 90 or 100 miles from his residence, from Lacey's residence to this area where he was fishing and where the body eventually surfaced. And when you think about that alone, Bill, just the likelihood that, oh, I just so happened to go fishing. It would be one thing if there were 3 or 4 lakes or bodies of water within a couple of miles of your house, and you
Mhm.
went fishing there, and the body of your deceased wife surfaces in one of the same areas. I think anybody could could claim that, well, yeah, this water's right here, and that's where she was murdered, and someone took her there. But it just so happens he drove 90 or 100 miles from his house to go fishing in a particular place in the San Francisco Bay. And just by pure horrible luck for him, his body's wife surfaces in the same general area.
Mhm. Yeah,
Coincidence?
right. Very unlikely. Very
Yeah.
unlikely. So after the body was although, Mark, I've heard people say on this case, I think, and this goes to the necessity to keep information confidential. And with a case like this, it was so hard because the news media was all over it. But even at, I don't know if it was a trial or maybe this was just speculation outside of the trial, but the police had said early on, right, that he said he was fishing. So the defense theory that, hey, the people that actually did the murder, they heard this, and that's where they disposed of the body to pin it on him, right?
Yeah, there's a little problem with that, but go ahead.
You're right. But I think that does go to the need for confidentiality when you're conducting an investigation. You have to really try not to let that information get out in the public because it has an impact and can put holes in your own case.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And there's always a balance. I think both know when we're talking about a missing persons case, there's always a balance about the confidentiality, the integrity of the investigation
Mhm.
versus what assistance you can gain from public interest, public awareness, what tips you might get. At some point, that scale starts sliding in favor of releasing information because your case is growing cold without any other leads. And so
Right.
again, I don't think there's any exact science to this, but certainly you're talking about a case going cold. Eventually, you have to start releasing some information. So, but you're 100% right, Bill. If you release it too soon or too much, it certainly can muddy the waters, pardon the pun, right now for your investigation.
Right. So he was arrested a short time after the body was recovered. In his car, Mark, talk about more circumstantial evidence. He had rope, knives, 4 cell phones, camping supplies, children's books, which we can talk about in a minute, $15,000 cash, his brother's ID, hiking boots, a shovel, a fishing pole. The police described the scene as, this is a quote, "This guy is like James Bond without the secret agent mission. He dyes his hair blonde. said it happened in his friend's pool, that it was like bleach from the chlorine in his friend's pool.
It there are look, O.J. Simpson claimed that he cut his hand on the door of the limousine when he was getting ready to go to the, airport at 11 o'clock at night or midnight or things like that, and of course, that was ludicrous face value. Matter of fact, if I remember correctly, O.J. Simpson, over time that's right, he claimed that he cut his hands 3 different ways in 3 different locations, by the way. I remember
Mhm.
2. One was in Chicago, he cut it on some glass in a hotel room sink, and then he cut it in a limousine door. I forget the 3rd way. My point is this, is that something like this, when you hear these types of statements that, "Yeah, my hair turned color because of the swimming pool," it implies that every time you go swimming in a swimming pool, your hair turns a different color.
Mhm.
And of course, I just don't think that it's so ludicrous. It is so ludicrous. And again, you couple this with all of the other inconsistencies over and over and over. Listen, anybody can make a claim, or strange circumstances can happen to anybody once or twice, maybe a few times over a long period of time. But when almost everything that you claim is either at face value really far-fetched, or it's easily proven to be untrue, in other words, over and over and over, that's where you start building a case of circumstantial evidence. And that's what we have here. There was nothing that he said. That was the thing. There was nothing that Scott Peterson said that was ever really proven to be accurate.
Right.
Nothing that I can think of, that I can remember, or what I've read recently.
Yeah, there was even some speculation when he, because I think I read somewhere that he had a gun with him as well when he was stopped, but I didn't see it in this article I was just describing where they recounted what was in his car. But there was speculation that, his plan may have been to find Amber Fry and murder her. I mean, that's something that I read, a little bit in a couple articles, that the speculation was that's where he was headed if he wasn't arrested that day.
Yeah, I remember something about that, and of course, it is speculation. We'll never
Yep,
know what was
yep.
what was coursing through his mind. But is that possible? Of course, it's possible, but who knows? By the way, if reading from the article again here, it's just the same day their bodies were found, Lacey and Connor, their unborn child, Scott Peterson, died us here, borrowed his brother's photo ID, and headed for the Mexico border with over $15,000. This
Mhm.
is $10,000 in cash. And the final jury needed just 7 hours to convict him and ultimately sentence him to death, which we'll talk about in a minute about the death penalty
Yeah,
being overturned. But again, that behavior, if you are innocent, if you know that you didn't commit the crime, there really is no reason to try to secrete your movements, your appearance, and then to flee. You would stay. First of all, thank God, or not thank God, but at least they found my wife's body. Now we
mhm,
have it. We have something that we can work with as far as finding the true killer. We can lay her and our son to rest, and my son to rest. Things like this, that his behavior was completely opposite and indicative of somebody with a guilty mindset, that I have to
yep,
flee the law because now they're onto me.
yep. So the trial starts in June '04. It's actually moved, I think, I don't know, about 90, 100 miles away to a different county. There were some concern that he wouldn't get a fair trial.
Mhm.
Uh One of the first kind of big witnesses in the case, and from what I understand, it changed because again, we both said there wasn't a lot of physical evidence here. I think the way I've seen it recounted, the witness that kind of changed the perception some of the jurors had in the case was Amber Fry. When she
Mhm.
started talking in August, when she started talking about the affair and what kind of person he was, I think that caused the jury to start going in the other direction. And the case, I guess, a momentum shifter. Let's put it that way. She was a momentum shifter for the prosecution and really was that push they needed, I think, to get a conviction. The defense contended that a satanic cult was behind the murder, Mark.
Hmm.
I don't think that was a very well received plan, although in looking into it, there was another pregnant woman abducted and murdered in California, and her body was found somewhat near that area. That kidnapping or murder happened on May 1st, and supposedly both May 1st and the 24th are days in the satanic calendar. So there was some method to the madness of the defense. I guess they found this other crime. And again, like we
Right.
talked about at the beginning, juris opportunism. They were going to try to piggyback onto that other case and say, look at this similar case. This is what happened in this case. Their dog was found. Now, if you remember, I think I don't know who told the story that she disappeared while walking the dog, but I
Hmm.
guess that's what the events were constructed to make it look like.
Right.
The dog was found in the street Christmas Eve with the leash attached, and a neighbor actually got the dog and put the dog in the Petersons' backyard and locked the gate. Now,
Right.
I know the mailman who delivered there. This is a big point in the case. He made it a point to say that whenever that dog was there, that dog always barked, always made noise, always barked, was always excited when the mailman was there. And he actually signed an affidavit swearing that the dog was not there earlier on the 24th when he made a mail delivery prior to when the neighbor found the dog in the street, which would
Hmm.
make sense, I guess, if the dog was out wandering in the street.
Right.
I guess when they polled the jury after the case, one of the big issues was, and this is a quote, some of the jurors said the loss of his wife, quote, didn't seem to phase him. And that didn't make any sense to the jurors. And you and I talked about that in American Nightmare. It's
Right.
when someone's physical or verbal response or their emotion doesn't fit what you think it should be in that situation, the body's trained to be a little skeptical in those cases and say, wait, something's not adding up and you're not reacting the way I think a normal person, a regular person would react given this set of circumstances. We already talked about the 90-pound purchase of concrete. Um, the cops said that they just had a gut feeling about him, and a lot of the things you said earlier about fishing, they reiterated. For example, he went fishing for the first time in, I don't know, X amount of years, 20 years, was it, Mark?
Yeah, it
He
was
he
something.
could he
It said into the 90s. I think it was early 90s, if I remember correctly. But let's just say, at least 10 years, something like that.
Yeah, he could not say what type of fish he was fishing for. He couldn't say what type of bait he used, and the kind of bigger question, he couldn't explain why he decided to leave his 8-month pregnant wife home alone the day of Christmas Eve so that he could go fishing in this 14-foot open boat in 40-degree weather, right?
Yes. And there were a litany of inconsistent statements, or let's put it this way, conflicting statements that he made to neighbors because these people were witnesses who testified. And he originally said that he was going to, yeah, I forget kind of business he had, but he said he was that morning he was leaving to go to his warehouse. I think then he changed it to going golfing. And then he
Mhm.
said, well, it was too cold to go golfing, so I decided to go fishing. And again, I brought that up earlier where it was too cold to go golfing in 40-degree weather, but it was just perfect weather to go on the San Francisco Bay fishing
Right.
in 40-degree windy weather. It's in other words, when you are making just one conflicting statement after another, after another, after another, these things add up. Again, we're all human. Everybody's human. And over any given period of time, when you're trying to recall something, when you're trying to recall facts as they happened, as best your recollection, anybody's going to get tripped up when it comes to over a period of time. But this, first of all, this was very, very fresh. This was like yesterday. My wife's
Mm.
missing, and the likelihood that you are going to forget or misspeak about one thing after another, after another, after another, after another, it's just it just doesn't add up. Um,
Yeah.
it's all very fresh. As far as physical evidence, by the way, Bill, they found Peterson's blood. This is Laci Peterson's blood was found on the door of Scott Peterson's truck, for which he gave, again, conflicting explanations. A few drops of blood were also found on their bedroom comforter. Caught in a pair of pliers recovered from Peterson's boat, police found hair matched to Laci's through mitochondrial DNA testing. Again, you have circumstantial evidence, you have physical evidence, you have witness statements. By the way, going back to Amber Fry, in you already spoke about this, about how she was a turning point for the prosecution because it just wasn't that one phone call that she had testified to about. Oh, he said he's in Paris, but it turned out he was
Hmm.
actually at a vigil for his wife. There were a number of recorded phone calls. I mean, in other words, she was doing this on behalf of the investigators. And so again, there's another source of statements that are completely inconsistent over and over and over and over and over. And this is the thing that we have to look at as, law enforcement. Again, it's the preponderance of the evidence. It's over and over. What sounds more feasible? What more
Hmm.
matches up with the evidence? What more supports the circumstantial evidence? Which group of witness statements all tend to lead in the same direction? This is what a true investigation is not. It's not getting, you cannot get every single thing right. Every piece of information may not point the same direction, physical or otherwise. Every witness statement may not point the same direction. But over time, when you start looking at the totality of things, that's what a true investigator does. Where does the information lead you in general?
Hmm. Interesting. Some of the things, though, like, let me give you this quote from one of the cops, Mark, and just tell me how you feel about this quote. This is what one of the police officers said. He wasn't in custody, but for a guy whose wife is missing to even get an attorney, not that he doesn't have the right to, that's not usual.
Hmm.
How do you feel about a cop saying that? Looking at what happened in American Nightmare, I feel like why? Like that's I don't know. What he's basically saying is, hey, you have nothing to hide. Why would you get an attorney?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I don't
Now,
think that's not the foundation of our justice
mhm.
system. In other
No,
words,
no, I
the
agree.
you can't use someone's you can't take a right that someone has, and
Mhm.
because they invoke that right, then say, "Ah, look, they're guilty because they invoked their rights. They
Right.
must have done something wrong if they're invoking their rights." I just feel like you can't say that. That's a dangerous precedent. That's a dangerous thing to even put out there in a criminal case. And when law enforcement officers have to know better than to bring something like that into the equation.
Well, I wanted you to finish your statement, your position in that, but of course I couldn't agree with you more. And this goes to just what I was saying a minute ago about there's so many pieces to any investigation. And there is the human side, whether it's a suspect, or it's the defendant, it's a witness, it's an investigator. Nothing is ever going to be 100% ever. In other words, in
Mhm.
its totality. And then you have something like this where again, it would never occur to me to actually put that out in a statement or anything that's free. In other words, I would never say that to a defendant, to a suspect that, oh, you got a lawyer, so it's obvious you're guilty. In other words, it just wouldn't occur to me. What occurs to me is if you are suspected of murdering your wife and your unborn child, you damn well better get a lawyer. In other words, we have you here
Yeah.
as a suspect, or at least a person of interest at the very least. I would get a lawyer. Absolutely. I want somebody to
Mhm.
tell me what I should do in this case because I haven't done anything wrong. And I want to make sure the world knows it. So I couldn't agree with you more. This is obviously, and this is an example of someone who did something that was less than professional and really less than called
Yep. And especially since not saying that to the defendant, but saying that to the media.
to the
Saying
media.
saying, "Hey,
But the
this."
thing is, you're
Yeah.
saying it to the defendant as well. In other words,
Right,
it's when it
right,
gets
right,
out there, not
right.
directly. And that's what I meant. But yeah, saying to the
Right, got
media,
it.
it's just it's less than professional, and of course, it undermines your credibility.
Right. So jury deliberation. Um, a couple jurors were dismissed. One was dismissed for doing his own research on the case. I don't really know
Mhm.
the details of that, but he was replaced by Rochelle Nice. That was the one, if you remember, Mark, the media called her by the nickname Strawberry Shortcake.
Oh, you know what?
She
I
had she
honestly
had
had
r
forgotten about that.
okay, yeah,
Remember
so
now?
she
Yes.
had red hair,
Mm.
and then the interesting one was the day after that, the jury foreman was removed at his own request after repeated clashes with fellow jurors. So he just basically said, "Hey, I had enough." I don't know, there was talk later that maybe it was a hostile situation, let me put it like
Mhm.
that. It was getting to be a hostile situation in the jury, and he said, "Hey, I wanna get out of here." I think juror Niece or Nice, there was talk that she lied on the about her criminal history or about some potential, some important question on the juror questionnaire,
Mhm.
and I know also after the case, she sent like I saw one report, she sent 12 letters to Scott Peterson in jail. Another report, she sent 17 letters to Scott Peterson in jail. She tried to sell a story or sold a story. Again, things that don't really do the process any favors. They give an appearance that's a little less than perfect. They give an appearance of a criminal case that makes it less than perfect and calls people to question things that probably, absent those issues, would not have even been questioned in the first place.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, and it's, obviously, when both sides are polling jurors, they're obviously looking for individuals that are favorable to their position. Prosecution
Mhm.
does it, defense does it. We all understand this. And unfortunately, and again, it's not the first time, nor will it be the last time that jurors are comprised of either people who, quite frankly, in my opinion, are incompetent to make a
Right.
reasonable, a logical decision, people that can easily be influenced, people who have an agenda. And we've seen that over and over and over. And I think sometimes, Bill, I think that sometimes, especially from prosecution's point of view, and this is for either
Mhm.
from personal observation with prosecutors or looking at it from a layman's point of view, retired point of view, I think that sometimes prosecutors get a little cocky, in other words, in their ability to prove a case, that they're
Yep.
sure. And again, I keep going back to this because there to me, there are a lot of comparisons between these two cases, this case and the OJ Simpson case. I think that there was an extraordinary amount of arrogance on from the prosecution team with the O.J. Simpson case in 1994. It was a murder, and I think 5 went to trial. And they get comfortable, and I think there is slipshod work when you're investigating. Now,
Mhm.
again, if people lie in a form or things like this, sometimes it's very difficult to vet someone. I get that. But I think prosecutors often get very, very comfortable, think that we have so much evidence, it's clear cut, any reasonable person will see this. They often don't do their due diligence, and that probably happened here as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mark. I saw that myself, and I would just use the term prosecutors or even investigators too,
Yeah.
cops, take stuff for granted. In other words, they understand what the evidence means because they handle it every single day on every single case they do. And when they see that evidence, they say, "Oh, this is awesome. This proves the case." But they don't successfully explain that to the jury. It's what is so obvious to the cop or so obvious to the prosecutor, they don't really explain that importance to the jury, or something's missing because of the arrogance that you talked about, or because they're taking it for granted so much, and the translation of that evidence is lost, and they lose convictions because of it.
Yes.
For sure. All right, so let's talk about, unless you got anything more on the OJ case, Mark, I would love to hear more. What do you got?
Well, I don't know if we're gonna dive in a little bit about the LA Innocence Project
Yes.
itself,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, I was
that's
gonna
where. So
start
yeah,
that
go
right
go ahead
now.
and start that, and it's
Okay.
exactly where we're gonna go with the OJ
So
case. Yeah.
so the LA Innocence Project, again, they filed an appeal on behalf of Scott Peterson.
Uh, uh,
Ironically, the
hey,
day
Bill,
I,
I'm
yeah,
I'm gonna interrupt here real quick. and I want you to go back, but of course I can't be that serious that long. Unlike Scott Peterson, O.J. Simpson is still looking for the real murderers.
Right. What was
It's
the
a
name of
cliche
that?
joke. I get it, but
No, it's not, because he was gonna write that, wasn't he gonna write a book that was called If I Did It? Or there was a deal for a TV show that was
I
called If I Did It?
I think he
And
wrote the book if I did it, I
the
think.
backlash was like, maybe they were gonna turn it into a movie,
Yeah.
and the backlash was so outrageous that they just killed that deal. But,
Yeah.
yeah.
No pun intended on kill.
Mm.
Um,
Hey, Mark,
but
I don't even know, this is probably a story I don't even, so this did come out because it was on CNN, but I had a buddy who was a Navy SEAL, got out of the Navy in '92. I don't know if I told you this story. And OJ was starting to make a movie when the murder happened, and
yeah.
I forget what the name of it was, but it had something to do with Navy SEALs.
Yes.
And my friend, who shall remain nameless, actually taught OJ how to fight with a knife.
Mhm.
He taught OJ how to fight with a knife, and one night I'm watching CNN, and there's my buddy explaining how he taught OJ to fight with a knife, and then, you know,
Try living with that one the rest of your life, huh?
yeah, I know, right?
Yeah. Sorry
Okay,
for the
so
interruption and the
yeah, yeah, yeah.
digression
So
here, but
no, listen, there's never that case lives forever.
yeah,
The
that's a
LA
podcast
Innocence
unto
Project,
itself.
right? The LA Innocence Project filing.
Mhm.
So there's four key areas that, and I'll leave it to you, Mark, to talk about the project itself, and maybe you want to touch on what else they've done, or why they do these things, whatever. But let me talk about the four things that they're highlighting, and they are somewhat interesting. And again, I want to stress with people: don't think that it's not a coincidence. Actually, don't think that it is a coincidence that they filed this in court the day after American Nightmare debuted, because they wanted to ride that wave of the cops had tunnel vision. My client didn't do it. They were just so focused on convicting him of murder that they didn't look at the real evidence in the case. And then they go on to highlight a couple things that they feel make up that evidence. So here are the four things. First, a witness claims to have seen Laci Peterson walking her dog around the neighborhood after Scott left to go fishing. Now, this was a neighbor named Vivian Mitchell, and she's since passed away, unfortunately. She said she saw Laci from her kitchen window 10:15 in the morning of Christmas Eve. Her husband said that he recalled it because Vivian said, "There's that beautiful pregnant woman walking the dog again." She called the police to report this. The husband says the police never called his wife back when she reported the sighting. And the husband said, quote, "it didn't fit their theory," unquote. And now the husband actually did file a complaint with the city about the police never contacting his wife to follow up on that claim.
Yeah.
It is what it is. Number two,
Mhm.
second thing, the house across the street was burglarized around the same time Laci disappeared. One theory was that she, while walking the dog, observed this burglary, interfered with this burglary, and that the burglars killed her. They were actually caught and interviewed, and they were cleared by the police. But the LA Innocence Project said more. Of course, they didn't confess to the murder. More needs to be done in this area. They want discovery on who these people were, the specifics of the interview. I don't know if that stuff was ever disclosed or what, but the police just said they were somehow cleared. The third thing, this is an especially interesting one, Mark. A van was set on fire in an alley a mile from the Peterson home. There was a blood-stained mattress in the back. A gentleman named Brian Spatulski of Modesto Fire Department said he investigated that van fire and he saw the bloody mattress. And he basically said, "Hey, I have no dog in this fight. I'm not saying it has anything to do with it. I'm not saying it doesn't have anything to do with it, but this needs to be investigated." The van belonged to an equipment and rigging company, and I guess all the employees of that company had access to the van. The last employee who used it said he returned it on December 27th, which didn't make sense because the police actually impounded it on the 25th after it was set on fire in an alley.
Hmm.
And then the final piece, Mark, which they make an issue of or with is Laci had, and this is an interesting one. I don't know what to make of this one. Laci had a watch that was sold at two separate pawn shops while she was still missing. The first sale of the watch was on December 31st, and the second sale of the watch was on February 14th. So the obvious question is what work this the Innocence Project is looking
Mhm.
for, what work the police did. Did they identify who pawned the watch? Did they interview those people? Who were they? What potential connection did they have to whether it was Scott who, or some other person that they feel did the murder? Yeah, and then just one other part that really goes back to the number 2, the burglary. There was
Right.
another neighbor named Diane Jackson. I guess she was the one that said she saw 3 men in a van in front of the home on December 24th, the morning, and the thought was that hypothetically, the van they were in could be the same van that was set on fire, and those could be the individuals that, uh, grabbed Laci, right?
Mhm.
That would be the defense's contention or the LA Innocence Project contention. They want they want discovery on those issues. They want to know what law enforcement did to investigate those issues because as they put it, they are making a claim of factual innocence. In other words, he
Right,
not
right.
guilty, but actual factual innocence.
Yeah, which I think whenever you're looking for factual innocence, and neither of us are lawyers, but you and I do know the difference between not guilty and
Mhm.
factual innocence. Proof that you did not commit a crime versus at least one juror saying, I don't think he or she did it. That's just saying not guilty, that the state couldn't prove its case. Two
Mhm.
different things. So two of those stories, Bill, I was not aware of. I was not aware of the pawning of her watch, which, by the way,
Mhm.
I find of everything here that the Innocence Project is throwing against the wall, the most intriguing of them. I find it
Yeah,
the most intriguing. I didn't know about that.
right.
And the witness, the so-called witness about Lacey walking her dog after it was reported she was missing. I don't put much weight in that because there are a
Mhm.
couple of things here. The way you actually read it to me, that the husband substantiated her wife saying this, his wife saying this. Oh, there goes that beautiful pregnant woman walking the dog. It's just too specific to me. I see my neighbors walking their dogs every day, and if I have told my wife about it, or she tells me I saw so and so walking down the street, I would never say, "Oh, there goes that beautiful woman, the pregnant woman," things like that. It just doesn't sound natural. But again, I'm getting deep in the weeds about witness statements, which I already talked about
Right.
before. That we could talk to 10 different witnesses. You're going to get 14 different versions of what happened. Okay, so witnesses by themselves are not terribly reliable. The the other one I didn't know about was the burning van, which is
Mhm.
interesting, but again, unless you actually have some nexus to her body, things like this, it is what it is. The one about the burglary, and this is very interesting because you talk about American Nightmare. This is again, it sounds too much like they're going after something from American Nightmare. I'm talking about the Innocence Project. In other words, they're trying to put the same type of doubt, the same type of image that maybe in potential jurors' heads that were in American Nightmare, and that is the burglary. So it says the biggest argument Peterson's defenders have that another perpetrator committed the murders is that a burglary occurred just down the street. Peterson and his advocates argue that the two perpetrators of the burglary, Donald Pierce and Stephen Todd, burgled the house on the morning of December 24th, and then in the process, they abducted Laci Peterson, so forth and so on. Fast forward a little bit down my page. Laci went missing on December 24th, Christmas Eve. The robbers didn't break into the neighboring house until the morning of the 26th.
Mm.
I mean, I don't know what any advocate, defense lawyer, any group would say other than, well, maybe they were there 2 days earlier casing this house and other houses and things like this. But like you said earlier, these two guys who broke into a neighboring house. They were cleared by the investigators of any involvement in the murder of Laci and her unborn child Connor. And the fact is, this particular robbery that took place close to the house took place 2 days after she went missing. So there's nothing here to me that would either exonerate Scott Peterson of the murder or put reasonable doubt in any reasonable juror's mind.
Mhm. I see that. And also with the van, I think the Innocence Project is asking for DNA testing of the blood if it's
Which is
still
fine.
even
Yeah.
possible. Right. Right.
Yeah,
So
and I
so do
want
that.
them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, no, that's it. That will answer the question.
Yes. So listen, I want every defendant, I don't care who you are. I don't care what I think of you personally. I want every defendant to have a robust, competent defense, every single person. And so I don't have any, obviously, any personal or emotional, like I said earlier, dog in this fight. If
Yeah.
they came up with some clear, undeniable physical evidence that exonerated Scott Peterson, then so be it. From what I can see here, 20 plus years into this, there has been nothing to this point. So a little bit about the Innocence Project, Bill, which is, I
Mhm.
said, I keep alluding to the O.J. Simpson case. So
Yep.
one of the two founders, there's two founders of it. It was founded in 1992, which is interesting. Tell you why in a minute. It says, and by the way, I'm reading from their own website. So if it sounds a little bit pro Innocence Project, then we'll all know why. Founded in 1992 by visionary attorneys Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck. Now, and I believe Peter Neufeld is one of the attorneys as well, but Barry Scheck, for sure, I remember, was part of the O.J. Simpson defense team.
I think he
I
was the
believe Peter
DNA guy.
DNA guy.
Wasn't Shaq the DNA guy? Yeah.
Yes, and I believe Neufeld as well. I could be wrong on that, but I believe they both were. But I know for a fact, from my recollection and from looking up the internet here, which is so reliable, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But
Right.
anyway, Barry Scheck was one of the dream team lawyers for O.J. Simpson. Like you said, he was the DNA guy, and DNA, of course, in criminal cases was very very new at the time. I can't even remember if a previous murder case or uh, other criminal case that actually had used DNA so much at that point. But Barry Scheck was one of those attorneys. And again, the O.J. Simpson case, the murder took place in, I think it was June of 1994, and then trial in 94 or 95, whatever it was. But he's the one that argued about the all types of levels. He wanted to, and he did apparently, he introduced doubt to the jurors about the reliability, the DNA in that particular case, in OJ's Simpson case, about the chain of evidence,
Mhm.
the integrity of the samples, were they contaminated, were they manipulated, so forth and so on. So the DNA guy, the DNA expert in this case actually argued that the DNA was not reliable. The DNA evidence was not reliable in the O.J. Simpson case. And again, which apparently the jurors bought along with some other stuff that I think that was erroneous presented by the defense team in that case. But again, it was a few years later after the Innocence Project was founded that he argued in front of the jurors in the O.J. Simpson case. So then we fast forward the years subsequent to the O.J. Simpson case and all of the cases that the Innocent Project has been a part of. Now, I want to say very clearly, if anyone or any group is able to exonerate a person for a crime that they were improperly convicted of, more power to them. And
Mhm.
this is coming from a 30-year law enforcement veteran. I'm talking to a 30-year law enforcement veteran. Bill, I can speak for you in this one. We don't want anybody who is innocent of a crime ever being convicted of it. 100%. The funny thing is on this one, from what I can tell, I think the vast majority of the cases here that the Innocent Project has looked into and exonerated people of as far as convictions has been based on DNA. And
Mhm.
you can correct me on that one. I didn't go too deep into this, but they do make obviously a lot of there's a lot of promotion of the use of DNA and other physical evidence in their exonerations of reversals of convictions of people. This one's different. This one's different because at least to this point, you mentioned the mattress and the burning van. At
Right.
least at this point, I don't really see anything where they're focusing on DNA. And I'm going to continue, but on that point, am I wrong, Bill?
No, the only potential DNA thing would be the blood stain on the mattress, which they did ask for DNA testing if it was even possible, if it's not so degraded by now that it can't be tested.
Yeah. And so I just don't know what their motivation is on this particular case. Again, they've exonerated a lot of people. By the way, speaking of exonerations, when I say exonerated, there is there's we talked about this a minute ago about innocent as opposed to not
Mhm.
guilty, reasonable doubt, reversals on procedural issues in courts, things like this. A lot of these cases that they've been involved in, it doesn't mean that the person still wasn't involved in a particular crime. What it means is that they prove, at least to a judge, a panel of judges, whatever it might be, prosecutors, that based on evidence that was previously used in a conviction, there's now enough reasonable doubt to say this may not have been as reliable as you claimed earlier. These reversals, or these people being released from prison, it doesn't mean that every single one of them was not guilty of the crime for which they were convicted. I want that to be clear. It means that there's a reversal because of reasonable doubt, procedural issues, and so forth and so on. So, as much as I'm all for people being exonerated for crimes that they didn't commit, I want to have people keep an open mind. That doesn't mean necessarily that they still didn't physically, did actual, in actuality, commit a crime.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. The only thing I would add, Mark, as we wrap this up, is it reminds me of, especially when talking about the pawn shop, right? The watch was pawned
Yes.
2 times.
Mhm.
Especially when talking about American Nightmare, you said something very wise a couple weeks ago, and it had to do with a police officer or an investigator having a theory and working to prove his theory and ignoring other information that didn't prove the theory. And you said something to the effect of that also needs to be investigated because it may end up it could prove the theory or it may not. I forget exactly how you worded it, Mark, and I'm probably not making a lot of sense here. That's my fear. But an example is this piece with the watch. Now, we don't know whether law enforcement investigated this or if they didn't. I'm not saying they did or they didn't. But hypothetically, if it was ignored because it didn't, quote, fit their theory,
Mhm.
the wrong move. Who knows? You may investigate that and you may find that it was actually Scott Peterson
Right.
that was involved in somehow giving that watch to someone to pawn or somehow being involved in that process. So the point you made a couple of weeks ago is you have to try to prove, disprove all the facts of a case, and that is how you get to the real truth. And I think, like specific to this case, you identified it, I identified it. The issue with the watch is very, very interesting,
Mhm.
and I would like to see what investigative work was done on that and where that led. And just because we don't know that now doesn't mean that that wasn't done.
Yeah, we don't know. That's a great point, Bill. We
Yeah.
don't know if that lead, that piece of information, it wasn't exhausted by the police. But you're absolutely right, and I don't remember what I said
Yeah.
either. But actually, when you said that I said something wise, I thought, well, you must be thinking of somebody else. That was the
No.
first thing that came to me. But this it's so important that law enforcement does their due diligence and they
Right.
provide a prosecutor, which in turn will provide a defense team with all exculpatory evidence. Say, hey, here's what we found,
Right.
and in other words, it shows objectivity. And by the way, I think that it makes a prosecution's job much easier later on, by the way, by law, the prosecution has to turn over any exculpatory evidence
Hmm.
information to the defense. So making your job easier, which is required by law in that sense. But in other words, from law enforcement, it makes everybody's job easier, especially when you're on the witness stand and say, hey, yeah, we did find things that we found XYZ, XYZ, blah, 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 whatever. Went down that path and we came to a dead end. So we went down the other paths here that took us to where we are today. In other words, it makes for a clean palette when you are subjective as an investigator as humanly possible, and don't let your predisposition as a human
Hmm.
being prevent you from doing what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, and here's what it was, Mark. I remember it was an email that in the Huskins case, an email that the kidnapper sent, and we found no evidence that the Vallejo police ever followed up on it. And on the one side, you would say, well, they didn't follow up on it because it didn't fit their narrative that he killed her. And you said, hey, you got to follow up on it because who knows? Maybe you'll find out that he actually sent the email.
Right.
So anyway, little nuances like that,
Mm.
they can have a huge impact on a criminal investigation. Mark, I think we've fully covered this. It'll be interesting to see where the Innocence Project takes this case. Again, to stress, it's not a coincidence, in my opinion, at least, that this was filed the day after American Nightmare came out. They are trying to ride the wave of what was created by that case. Um, the truth, do I think the right person is in jail for the murder of Laci Peterson? Yes, I do. That the amount of circumstantial evidence is overwhelming, but that does not mean that you have to always be professional and follow up on everything and continue to work appeals, etc., because that's what the justice system in this country is, and that's what we owe to people, whether they've been convicted or they're standing trial. Anything else?
Amen to that. That's all I got.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.